So the stock market's down for the first time in a long time, and that prompted the Fox propaganda network to quickly pounce and try to blame it all on President Biden and Vice President Harris, which in turn led to a brutal fact check of a Fox News host and his MAGA co-host by a Fox News financial analyst, and it was glorious. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we got a couple of clips to look at. The stock market is down about 1,000 points. We're going to get into that, but I do want to lead with this clip because it's so much fun. Okay, so again, as you know, the Fox Propaganda Network, they have a whole system set up. Anything good that has ever happened in the history of civilization is because of Donald Trump and Republicans. 100% full stop. Anything bad that has ever happened in civilization is because of President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Democrats. That's the rule. Okay, so any bad economic news, they pin it all on Democrats, regardless of whether or not they're in or out of power, and vice versa for good news with Republicans. Okay, so get that framing in mind. So we're going to play this clip of a brutal fact check by Peter Wolf, a Fox News financial analyst and economist. It's so good. We'll play this clip and unpack it together.
Robert, you cover the economy as well. If we're headed for a recession, how difficult could this be for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I'd love to debate both you guys on the economy. GDP's higher, jobs is higher, wages is higher. The stock market's up huge under Biden. This idea of what you guys are talking about, there's more 2,000-day losses under President Trump than 500-day losses under Joe Biden. We should get the facts right on where the economy is. Bill, you do a great job on that. But we know that Friday was, if not for the outstanding 15 million plus jobs of the Biden-Harris campaign over the last 3.5 years, 140,000 less plus is normal jobs. There's not going to be a recession. I actually think that there's a possibility that we're going to have the August numbers look incredibly strong.
Well, a lot of those recovery jobs coming back, we know that. But listen, the markets were spooked to the end of last week based on that job. The markets were spooked. Robert.
So he tried to cut him off here, stammer. Well, you know, actually, most of that was done because of COVID bounce back. So I love talking about this because it's so important. First things first, as Steve Ratner has pointed out, MSNBC financial analyst, he's fact-checked Trump and MAGA on this relentlessly. Trump's claim that Biden only added bounce-back jobs is simply not true. 6.2 million more Americans are employed relative to pre-pandemic levels. Okay, so even once you control for COVID, the bounce-back, the recovered jobs, President Biden, or 6.2 million jobs have been created under President Biden's watch. Here's the other thing. Even if you control for COVID, the average jobs created each month under President Biden is better than Trump's. Again, count COVID. Don't count the COVID job losses for Trump. Don't count the COVID bounce back for President Biden. It doesn't matter. Average monthly job creation is about 100,000 jobs greater, 80 to 100,000 under President Biden than it ever was under Donald Trump. Trump simply loses when it comes to evaluating jobs. In total, monthly averages, control for COVID, don't control for COVID. It doesn't matter. It all arrives inevitably at the same conclusion, which is that Biden's record is simply objectively far better than Trump's. The other thing I'll remind you is I reject the framing of it. You know, Bill Hemmer is implying like, well, listen, we got to grade Biden and Trump on separate curves. You know, it's not fair to count the bounce back, the so-called bounce back jobs. So a couple of things. Number one, yes, it is. Number one, if the shoe was on the other foot, would Fox News be saying, yeah, you know what, we can't count this against a Democratic president? Imagine that COVID happened under President Barack Obama and Republicans were trying to blame Obama for job loss or the subsequent Republican president for job recovery. Would Fox News go, well, hang on, wait a minute. We can't count job loss under Obama because that happened due to a pandemic, and we can't really count jobs created under his Republican successor because that was COVID or pandemic bounce back? They would never say that. Of course they wouldn't. Fox wouldn't do it. Republicans wouldn't do it. They would say, listen, if something bad happens under a Democratic president has a responsibility to manage it well or to prevent the bad thing from happening in the first place. And if they fail to do so, they should get the blame. Well, that's the same standard I apply to Republicans as well. If the bad thing happens under a Republican president, then I think it's perfectly fair to blame them for it, especially if they actually play an active role in managing it. Donald Trump was chief executive during the COVID outbreak. He had a responsibility to follow the science, to empower consistently his top medical advisors, and to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to rally the nation. And Democrats demonstrated they were willing to work with him. They helped him pass 2 sweeping COVID stimulus bills during an election year, knowing that he would get the damn credit for it, but they did it anyway. So Trump had no excuse. The opposition wasn't from the Democratic Party, it was from his own party because of his stupidity and his inability to manage the pandemic well. So yes, he is responsible for it. President Biden presided over the COVID, the vaccine rollout, the COVID management that he inherited. And under his leadership, 70% of American adults got at least one COVID vaccine. That helped the economy open safely back up from the Trump era lockdowns, right? And jobs that were lost were restored in other ways. And actually, as a matter of fact, the reason that we know it's not true COVID bounce back is there were jobs and businesses lost during the pandemic, which never came back. So this idea that simply because it was lost during the pandemic, it was inevitable it would come back elsewhere is simply not true. It was competent Democratic leadership, as well as the passage of things like the American Rescue Plan, right, which created 4 million jobs and prevented a double-digit recession, according to Moody's Analytics. Democrats voted for it. It was President Biden's plan. Republicans voted against it. You also have the manufacturing jobs brought back because of the Chips and Science Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law that President Biden passed. So all these things are creating a very, very robust jobs market, certainly compared to what was the case under Trump. So these fact checks are really important. It's so good that occasionally Fox News analysts will push back on Fox News hosts, suggesting that the Biden economy is terrible and that the Trump economy was vastly superior. It's not. And I love the fact that even if we're evaluating the stock market has performed worse under Donald Trump than it has under President Biden. Now, with that in mind, a couple of other things to point out. Let's get to the predicates. So the Dow has dropped 1,000 points, and Japanese stocks suffer a worst crash since 1987 as markets quake worldwide. A scary Monday that started with a plunge abroad, reminiscent of 1987's crash, swept around the world and pummeled Wall Street with more steep losses as fears worsened about a slowing U.S. economy. The S&P 500 dropped 3% for its worst day in nearly 2 years. The Dow Jones Industrial Average reeled by 1,033 points, not 333, or 2.6%, while the NASDAQ slid 3.4%. Okay. It was the first chance for traders in Tokyo to react to Friday's report showing U.S. employers slowed their hiring last month by much more than economists expected. That was the latest piece of data on the U.S. economy to come in weaker than expected. And it's all raised fear that the Federal Reserve has pressed the brakes on the U.S. economy by too much for too long through high interest rates in hopes of stifling inflation. Now, we are not in a recession. We may end up in a recession, but we are not in a recession yet. And economists right now are divided about how worried they are, or like if they're full on panic or they're just a little cautious. Justin Wolfers, an economist, pointed this out in his response to J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, of course, took the political chance, blaming Vice President Harris, even though she's not even president, she's just the candidate he's running against. He and Donald Trump are running against, blaming Vice President Harris for the current economy, which of course is ridiculous for a variety of reasons, but whatever. Let's say you take the political shot. Well, Justin Wolfers pointed out, you're right, Senator, the S&P 500 is down 3% so far today, or as I like to say, up only +9 so far throughout 2024, up 14% over the past 12 months, or up 55% since Trump left office, thus reminding these Republicans of the fact that the stock market, which is not, in my opinion, the most important macroeconomic metric. Now, according to Republicans, it is, until it's doing really well under Democrats. And then actually, no, it's really not that important at all. We did a whole video a couple of months ago about Sean Hannity trying to walk all that back. When the stock market was performing well under Donald Trump, the stock market was the most important thing in the world. When it's doing well under Democrats, not so much. But yeah, the fact of the matter is that the economy, generally speaking, under President Biden has performed better than under Donald Trump. And Fox would have you believe otherwise. But facts don't care about your feelings, right? That's what Ben Shapiro likes to say. And listen, if you want to debate to what extent a president, any president, liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, can take credit, genuine credit, for what goes on in the economy, that's fair. The president's the most powerful and important office in the world. There's no question about it. But they have very little direct control over the economy. It's not like he can snap his fingers, and raise and lower gas prices, right? There was this idea at the beginning of President Biden's administration that he could just snap his fingers and lower gas prices, but chose not to. This idea that he has some sort of like lever to control gas prices. Why? Number one, if such a lever existed, why wouldn't every president lower gas prices? Because presumably that would increase favorability of the economy on their watch and make it more likely that they and their political party are rewarded in the subsequent election. Number one, right? Number two, why didn't Trump pull that lever during the 4 years in his administration? And number three, why would we assume that that's the case in the first place? It doesn't really make any sense, does it? So with giving President Biden credit for like jobs, which was the main sticking point between Bill Hemmer and Robert Wolf, not Peter Wolf, I called him Peter Wolf, Robert Wolf. Well, we can actually point to things that Biden did to help create the job market: the vaccine rollout, pandemic management, the American Rescue Plan, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act. All of these things have led to pretty steep increases in job creation, manufacturing jobs, construction, investment. We can actually tie these things together. But the Fox Propaganda Network doesn't want to cope with that. And actually, in another video I'm going to show you here a little later, another Fox News host actually calls Trump out and Republicans out for their hypocrisy and their double standards with respect to the economy. But you have to wait for that one. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.